Hi, everybody. Welcome to LibertyCon 2021 Virtual Edition. I'm Les Johnson. I really miss seeing everybody. And I want to start out by saying that I've been to all the LibertyCons, almost all of them, since LibertyCon 2, way back in the day. And the Space Update's a tradition, and I'm glad to be able to present it to you today so that we can continue that tradition until we can next get together. Let me bring up my slides, and you'll be able to see a little bit about what we're doing. Let me make sure I got the right thing up here. And of course, you fumble and bumble and think you're doing it right, and then you don't. There we go. Got it. So this is all my social media information, so you know how to reach out to me. I am widely available on the internet. I try to keep my Facebook, Instagram posts up to date pretty regularly. You can find out what's going on by visiting my website, lesjohnsonauthor.com, or you can email me at les.johnson@rocketship.com. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with the Space Updates, or this might be your first LibertyCon, let me give you a little background about who I am and why you might want to hear me talk about the Space Update. Going to my next slide, just a little bit of background. I am a physicist. I've been working in the aerospace industry for over 30 years. You can tell I'm a bit follically challenged. I did go to undergraduate, and believe it or not, it's a real school, Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. It's a small liberal arts college where I got a BA in physics. Did my graduate work as I moved south, moving to Nashville, beautiful city. Went to Vanderbilt for graduate school. Attended something called the International Space University. I was sent there by my employer at the time, and current employer, which is NASA. And that lets me bring up now that I do work for NASA at the Marshall Space Flight Center here in Huntsville, Alabama. But every time I'm at a convention, I have to let people know I don't represent my employer. I speak at conventions as Les Johnson, private citizen. I'm also a writer. I write popular science and science fiction books. These are some of my more recent books. Many are available. If we were in person, I'm sure they'd be available in the dealer's room, but you can find all of them online in various formats. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your favorite local booksellers. Support your local bookstores. I've written popular science nonfiction books on topics like solar sailing, this great super material, graphene, with my co-author Joe Meany. Also have edited some anthologies and written science fiction for Baen Books. And in fact, I have 2 books coming out this year from Baen. Coming in August is a book I co-wrote with Travis Taylor. It's the first book in a new universe, a new trilogy called Saving Proxima. And then I have a solo novel coming out in October called The Space-Time War. So let's get started. Let's talk about what's happened in the year of COVID in space, and it's a lot. I mean, this has been a big year for space development and space exploration. Just to start out with some numbers, get the numbers out of the way early, get the chart out of the way early so I don't put you to sleep later on. This lists the number of launches in 2020 by country, and you can see that the US had the largest number of launches, followed very closely by China. Russia's a distant third, with various other countries having multiple launches in there. I do want to say, when I've been doing this space update at LibertyCon, if I were to dig back in my files by 10 years, the US at that point had fallen to 3rd or 4th on the list with number of launches. The Europeans had by far the most, followed by maybe us, Russia, and China, kind of neck and neck. That's really turned around in the last 10 years. And we're back where we are when I started in the aerospace industry in the 1990s, when the US dominated the launch market. So this is truly a dynamic market for who launches rockets carrying payloads into space. And as you might guess, a certain company called SpaceX and their business model has upended the commercial launch sector. And that's been a good thing for the country as a whole, as we've reclaimed our lead in terms of the leading power launching things into space. Exciting year. If you look at things of particular interest to those of us that are science fiction fans, there were 3 missions to Mars launched. No surprise that the US launches one on a cadence of about every 2 years. That 2 years is driven by when the planets line up, literally. They have to be in a favorable position in order to have a minimum energy trajectory to get from here to Mars, and it still takes 7 months. But if we didn't launch in this launch window where the planets line up approximately in the right place every 2 years, given our different orbits around the sun, that voyage would take considerably longer. So we launched two rovers. We launched a rover, the Perseverance, which has that great little Ingenuity helicopter, which has been flying around and doing the first powered flight on Mars. Another first is China, who successfully landed a lander and a rover on Mars. And I don't want to understate how important this achievement is and how significant it is for China, essentially on their first try. Because in the history of Mars exploration and trying to land, over half of the landers that the countries of the world have tried to land in the history of space exploration have failed. The Russians, previously to that, the Soviets, failed time after time after time. It's very difficult to do. And the Chinese have done it, as have we. And there is in orbit around Mars a spacecraft, not a lander, from the United Arab Emirates called the Hope Orbiter, which is going to add to the Mars fleet of international spacecraft which are currently observing Mars. So big, big year beginning with Mars. On the vein of the rising space power of China, I have to give kudos to them for their accomplishment of their next lunar landing and a lunar sample return mission, the Chang 5, successfully landed on the moon. Here's a picture looking down from a camera on the lander. They're going to be bringing samples back, and I'm not sure of the status of that mission as to whether those have actually come back or on their way, but if not, they will be soon. Big achievement there also for China. Back in the US and the European consortium, there was the OSIRIS-REx, which landed on an asteroid called Bennu, and the goal is to bring samples back to Earth of the asteroid for study. I love these animated GIFs. They really give you a sense of what happens when you try to land on an object that doesn't have much gravity. It's more of a rendezvous and docking maneuver. This lander actually bounced a few times before it came to rest successfully on Bennu. Big deal. The Europeans launched another solar orbiting mission, this one called Solar Orbiter, appropriately enough. We have a mission currently orbiting the sun, getting closer and closer to it. It was launched prior to 2020, so I don't really talk about it much here. But the sun is the subject of a lot of renewed interest in a field called heliophysics. It turns out we don't really understand a lot about the sun. You might be familiar with the 11-year solar cycle and solar maximum, a lot of activity on the sun and the sunspot rising and solar minimum. There are longer term variations in there, and solar scientists don't really understand the underlying causes of a lot of this, and we need to be studying the sun in a lot more detail. And I bring that up because you would think, given that the sun is what provides our heat and light and energy to power our world and feed life on the planet, that we would understand it better than we do. And we really don't. We know the basics, but there are a lot of its mysteries that need to be unraveled. And there will be a whole fleet of spacecraft over the next decade or more that will be looking at the sun in new vantage points and taking new measurements to try to get a better understanding of how it works and what drives potential risks to our civilization, like with big solar flares and those kinds of things. In terms of human spaceflight, last year, big year, the US, for the first time in a decade, returned astronauts to space, going to the space station, launching on an American rocket from American soil. We hadn't done that since the retirement of the space shuttle back in the early 20-teens. I think it was 2011. And it was a big deal also because it was the first time that we paid for commercial services to take astronauts to space. NASA, contrary to popular belief, for rockets that launch unmanned payloads, NASA's been commercially contracting that since 1988 or the late 80s. We stopped launching our own satellites to space many years ago and had competitive bids to industry for launching those satellites. So that's been around for a long time. What's new is paying private company to carry people to space. And there were two companies awarded the contract to do that under NASA's Commercial Crew Program. One was Boeing and one was SpaceX. SpaceX was first out of the gate, proving their capsule and the technology to take astronauts to space. And in 2020, they did the first commercial crew. Big deal. Very successful. Took astronauts to the space station. I'd like to point out that the space station is still there, still flying, still doing great science. The last module of the space station was fitted on it in 2011. The first flew in 1998. And the space station, with all the experiments that are being done with countries from around the world in different modules, all connected together, orbiting the Earth at about 400 miles. Will continue to be there at least until 2025. And then there'll be a decommissioning unless its lifetime is extended further. So that's a big deal. The space station's been an exceptionally successful effort, a collaboration of many nations, and will continue to be a big part of our human spaceflight science and technology efforts for years to come. I also want to, of course, show, if I can get it to play here. We had the Starship X, SpaceX big booster test flight. This was actually only one of the stages that will eventually be a part of this big rocket. And that's a big deal. Carrying a lot of mass to space is not easy to do. The space shuttle carried a lot. A lot of the payload that was in the space shuttle was in the reusable part of the shuttle itself. And this vehicle from SpaceX is the next step toward potentially returning astronauts to the moon. And I know that Elon Musk has plans to use this as upper stage on a big rocket to ferry people to Mars, to realize his dream of taking people to Mars. So it's a big step forward in rocketry, and kudos to all the companies that are developing these private rockets. It's really going to help us in our development of space. Yeah, just gotta love watching rocket launches. It's a big part of what's kind of exciting. It's the kind of thing I'd like to be there in person. As a quick side note, I've seen one rocket launch other than the little Estes rockets that I built as a kid, and that was a night launch of the space shuttle. I cried. It's an emotional experience when you feel the reverberation of the low frequency sound shakes you, sort of like when you're at a parade and you hear the drummers go by. Brought tears to my eyes. It's an amazing thing. I look forward to seeing a SpaceX launch or another launch from any company here in the future. Speaking of SpaceX, there are Starlink wireless internets now in beta testing. As of the end of last year, there were almost 1,000 satellites in their constellation in low Earth orbit. These are little small satellites swarming around the Earth. They're in their public beta testing phase. Now, you can see in the bottom left here is a picture of the satellites soon after they were launched at dusk, as they're not yet separated into their orbits. This is a big deal for astronomers. Turns out that what's good for satellite and space development is not necessarily good for astronomy. And there's been a lot of complaints from astronomers that their long exposure photography of distant stars is being ruined by the overflight of SpaceX Starlink satellites. It's not all a plus for space development to have all this in space. There's also the increased risk of orbital debris. So just be aware of, they're trying to mitigate that. These satellites are supposed to have a very short lifetime after they stop working to try to not have an orbital debris problem. But if we're launching thousands of these satellites into orbit, it does increase problems for traffic control. But it's still a huge achievement. It's another step in our development of space. I'd like to point out this is also a big deal accomplished last year that probably didn't make the headlines like a lot of other things did. This was the first ever robotic satellite servicing. Northrop Grumman, big aerospace company, built the Mission Extension Vehicle, MEV-1. And basically what it did is it went up to a satellite that was not working right. It was an Intelsat telecommunications satellite, and it basically grabbed it, used its onboard propulsion system to put it back into its operating orbit, and it's been recommissioned, and now that really expensive Intelsat communication satellite will continue to operate for another 5 years thanks to this robotic servicing. Now, the reason this is a big deal is because those geocomsats are big and expensive birds. They can cost in the billions of dollars. And when one of them stops working or runs out of prop and goes off station, if you have something like an MEV-1, which is much less expensive to build, that can reposition multiple satellites back in their orbital slots and keep them operating, you're saving a lot of money for some big companies. So this whole notion of in-space servicing is huge. Now, we've done in-space servicing before, but in the past it was done with the shuttle and done with crew. This is the first time it's been done robotically. The Chinese, going back to the Chinese, they've sent a robot to Mars, they've sent robots to the moon, they're talking about sending people to the moon, and they are sending people to low Earth orbit. They are building their own modular space station. And here in the big graphic is an artist concept of what that will look like when it's complete in 2022, just next year. On the left side of the screen is one of the modules on the ground being assembled for launch before integration. So in addition to the International Space Station, there will be a Chinese space station orbiting the Earth, and it'll be fairly new compared to the aging ISS. Personally, I'm kind of looking forward to finding out what's going to happen over the next, I don't know, decade or more as the ISS ages and the Chinese space station is growing and such. Talking about human spaceflight, NASA has plans to return to the moon. I was very, very nervous looking at history when we changed presidential administrations and changed parties in the last election. Historically, when a new party comes to power, they change what NASA's doing in its direction. In my career, embarrassingly, 30 years worth, I have been told we were going back to the moon not once, not twice, but 3 times. And when you're being told for the 3rd time in your career that you're going to do something, and the previous 2 times we've had elections where the new party comes into power and cancels it, you get a little jaded, right? But I am excited because space, as it should be, appears to be a nonpartisan, trans-party supported activity. And as a taxpayer, and again, I'm not speaking as a representative of NASA, and I'm not working on the lunar program, I was thrilled to see a commitment by the new administration to continue with the plans of returning astronauts to the moon in this decade. To that end, they had a competition and picked 3 companies for the lander to put people on the moon. They had a competition between them, and selection was made to go with SpaceX for returning astronauts to the moon. However, no sooner had that selection been made than there was a protest by the losing teams, and that whole selection process is being reviewed. This is all public knowledge, so we don't know what's going to happen with that yet, although NASA had initially made its selection. Speaking of controversial selections being reviewed, the Space Force selected Huntsville as the location for their new headquarters. This was an announcement made about a year ago. Big deal. Huntsville celebrated. The competition had been going on for a few years. There were sites in various states that were vying for the headquarters of Space Force. One was Huntsville, several sites in Colorado, including the current home of U.S. Air Force Space Command, a site in Texas. We're all vying for this. And based on the base realignment and closure committee, however the Congress does these things, they did a multi-factor assessment and determined Huntsville was the place to go. But of course, as is typical, as soon as that was announced, the Congress critters from the various states that didn't win protested, and so now that selection process is also in review. I do want to mention that just following the news, because I'm not involved in this at all personally, this is the 2nd time they've selected Huntsville, and the 2nd time it's gone back into review. The last time it went back into review, they had a new competition where Huntsville won again. So we'll see how this independent review comes out. But it looks like Huntsville might be on the receiving end of the consolidation of space efforts with a NASA Field Center. The Army space activities here, Space and Missile Defense, is located here in Huntsville, and hopefully soon Space Command. It's a big deal for the Southeast. Coming up also in human space flight, a company that I know you've heard of, but has not been as out there, I guess, at this point as SpaceX, and that's a Blue Origin. That's Jeff Bezos' aerospace company. Well, the New Shepard flight is going to happen this year, taking people on a suborbital trajectory as the first step for paying customers to take trips suborbital and come back down. And it's my understanding that there are hundreds of people who've already paid to do this. And it was just announced that on the first commercial suborbital flight from Blue Origin, no less than Jeff Bezos himself is going to be riding that bird up into space and back. So that's a big deal. He's got to be looking all the mission safety engineers in the eye and telling them, you got to bring me back, dude. So we'll all be watching for this launch later this year. That's pretty exciting that people will now be able to commercially become astronauts at not necessarily spending tens of millions of dollars like those that had paid to go up to the space station to do so. I had mentioned earlier this whole notion of commercial crew where SpaceX had carried passengers to the ISS. I mentioned that Boeing was another competitor for that. They had a test of their Starliner, which is their equivalent of Dragon for carrying people to the ISS. They had an unmanned test last year, and it didn't work well. There were lots of problems. They have another uncrewed flight, which is going to happen this year to test the Starliner. If that's successful, it'll be commissioned, and then they too will be a commercial company carrying astronauts to and from space for NASA with the Starliner. The United Launch Alliance, which is a commercial launch company, hybrid funded from Boeing and Lockheed Martin, which has a rocket assembly plant in Decatur, Alabama. If you attended the Interstellar Research Group, formerly the Tennessee Valley Interstellar Workshop in Huntsville a few years ago, we had a site visit, and people who attended got to go into that plant where they make the rockets and see an Atlas V rocket being assembled. Well, they're currently working on the Vulcan rocket, which would be a competitor to SpaceX for unmanned launch of vehicles. So they are going to be having a test flight later this year of the Vulcan rocket. Also upcoming is the long-awaited launch of the James Webb Space Telescope. Shown here on the left is the integrated spacecraft, what it'll look like when it's all unfurled in space and starts doing its astronomy and its observations. On the right is the rocket that's supposed to carry it to space. It's a European Ariane 5 rocket. And the launch readiness date for this is no earlier than October 31st of 2021. So it could fly anytime after Halloween. Now, does that mean it'll be in 2021? You don't know. The plans are to launch it as soon as it's safe and as soon as things are ready to go. So very soon now, we could have Hubble's successor in space doing astronomy and helping us maybe get a better look and understand some of these exoplanets that we're finding out there. It's pretty exciting. There's also something that's of interest to those of you who are worried about us going the way of the dinosaurs from an asteroid impact, and that's the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, the DART mission. Shown here is an artist concept of the DART spacecraft on its way to impact an asteroid, Didymos B. This is to determine and actually test if we can use kinetic energy impacts to deflect and change the course of asteroids to potentially keep them from hitting the Earth. If there's an Earth-threatening asteroid coming our way. Pretty cool stuff. Check out the book Travis and I wrote called Onto the Asteroid if you want to hear about how to deflect an asteroid and maybe save civilization. Hopefully a little bit better than Bruce Willis's take on that in the movie a few years ago. But it is something important, and we don't want to go the way of the dinosaurs when it comes to asteroid impacts. Pretty scary stuff. I would be remiss if I didn't give you an update on the Near-Earth Asteroid Scout. NEA Scout will be NASA's first interplanetary solar sail mission using a solar sail, a thin reflective material about the thickness of a human hair. This will be almost 1,000 square feet in area. You can see a picture of the sail on the bottom right, fully deployed in test here in Huntsville. It was deployed from that little spool that's on the left, where it's all folded and rolled up and packaged in a small spacecraft that you see in the top left. And that small spacecraft is only a little bit bigger than a boot box. So if you're sitting at a desk, your desk could hold 5 or 6 of these things, okay? It's going to fly, deploy 4 booms that are each 21 feet long to unfurl that nearly 1,000 square foot solar sail. That'll take the spacecraft with a camera to do an observation of an asteroid. That asteroid won't be taking samples of it, but it'll be taking high-resolution imagery of it. And we're scheduled to launch this fall as one of the payloads on the Space Launch System. After the SLS flies and sends the Orion capsule to the moon, there are multiple of these small spacecraft that will be launched from SLS. One of them is NEA Scout, being developed collaboratively between NASA Marshall here in Huntsville and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I mentioned it's our first interplanetary solar sail mission. I have been fortunate to be the lead for that mission, something called the Principal Investigator. And of course, there's a picture of me taken a couple of years ago at the test of the sail. It was in a clean room, so I'm wearing the garb with the glasses, of course, I always wear, but the facial covering and it's called a bunny suit. But it was an exciting set of tests, and I'm thrilled that we're about to see flight, and we'll be flying for about 2.5 years on the flight to the asteroid when we launch in hopefully as early as this fall. Now, I would like to point out that in December of 2020, in the last year, NASA selected its next big solar sail mission called Solar Cruiser, which will fly in 2025. And instead of a nearly 1,000 square foot sail, the sail will be 18,000 square feet. If you don't know how big that is, go to Home Depot. It's roughly the floor area of a big size of Home Depot. It's about a third the area of a football field. It's also very thin, 2.5 microns, which is the thickness of a human hair. It will fly toward the sun. I have a whole talk on solar sails I can give another time that says how you can actually use a sail, which you would think would be pushed from the sun, to fly toward the sun, and will position itself on a line between the Earth and the sun and use solar pressure to constantly thrust to remain there. And that's a capability of interest to solar scientists who want to study the sun, who are the ones funding this mission. So Solar Cruiser will fly in 2025. And in case you haven't guessed, yes, yours truly, me again, I am the principal investigator for Solar Cruiser, and I'll be leading the development of that mission while we're flying the Near-Earth Asteroid Scout. So sail development continues right here in Huntsville area, not far from Chattanooga and LibertyCon. And it's big events coming up in the 2021 through 25 timeframe for solar sailing. Well, that's my update. There's a lot more to talk about. There's the launcher company Rocket Lab, who's been launching small payloads into space. Believe it or not, there's an electrodynamic tether in space, which I didn't have time to go into here. It's called Drag Racer. Those of you who've known me from those earlier LibertyCons know that I had a flight experiment using tethers. I'm thrilled that those continue with the flight of Drag Racer. You can Google that and look it up. It's a small spacecraft launched by Millennium Space Systems that's going to prove out the capability of using magnetism for propulsion in Earth orbit, and various other achievements, again, which I just didn't have time to go into in the time we have available here today. To conclude, I want to remind you that I do come to LibertyCon because I love you guys. I'm a big fan. I always have been. I've been reading science fiction since elementary school. I started writing it about 10 years ago. You got to feed your authors. So I urge you to check out my books. I've highlighted the ones that are coming out this year. It's a big year for me. With August release of Saving Proxima with Travis, a new novel. The second printing and the first trade paperback edition of the anthology that I co-edited with the great Jack McDevitt called Going Interstellar will be out. These are original short stories about what our first trip to the stars might be like, coupled with some nonfiction essays written to bring the reader along in the latest science in terms of how we might actually go to the stars. And then my first foray into space opera is The Spacetime War, which will be released in October from Baen Books in trade paperback, which explores basically love lost across the centuries and an interstellar war. So not only do I want to take you on an adventure through time and space, I want to tug at your heartstrings a little bit there. So I hope you enjoy those. They are going to be widely available. Let me know if you have any questions. My website, again, is lesjohnsonauthor.com, and you can reach me at les.johnson@rocketship.com. Thank you very much.